So recently I watched a South Korean horror movie called Exuma. And it wasn't really the scariest movie. It wasn't scary at all, actually. There was really no point in the film where I was, frightened at all. But the film did have an interesting political message underneath all of the theme of horror that it was trying to present. So the movie is about this guy who sells lots for funerals, for burials, and this very, very superstitious but very wealthy man wants to exhume the body of his grandfather because he believes that his family is being tormented by some sort of a supernatural curse. So he hires some shamans, and the shamans tell him, well, your grandpa is angry because his body has not been cremated or something like that. So you got to unearth your grandfather's corpse and then go through the ritual. So they end up unearthing the corpse. At some point or another, some sort of a curse is unleashed, and the wealthy and superstitious son is possessed. He becomes possessed. And the moment that he gets possessed, he, of course, starts acting very, very strange. Now, what sort of strange behavior does he exhibit? Well, he... This might harken someone back to what happened during the inauguration event recently. But this wealthy Korean guy just, boom, he just pops off with the Hitler salute. Boom. And so the demon makes him do the Nazi salute. Now, you might have some crazy nationalists watching, and there probably are nationalists watching this right now, and they're going to say, it's the Roman salute. Ah, yes, because we just commonly do this to remember the glory of Rome. Right, of course. So this Korean guy, he just pops off with the Hitler salute, and he starts screaming all this praise for the Japanese Empire, and he becomes a Japanese nationalist. Well, he's Korean. How could he be a Japanese nationalist? Well, it turns out that his grandfather was a collaborator with the Japanese, and so the demon that he unleashes makes him act like his grandfather. And so he begins to praise the Japanese. And so it's a movie. It was decently done. It's kind of corny, kind of silly. It's not the best horror movie. It's not the scariest movie. In fact, it's not scary at all. But the film makes one wonder about the satanic influence that leads peoples, that leads nations into mass murder, into utter depths of depravity, into bloodlust, into murderous desires. It makes one wonder about how the satanic world just moves people. I talked about this in one of my last videos. I talked about how we are in the midst of a cosmic chess match between God and Satan, and how the devil doesn't necessarily work in terms of days, weeks, or even decades, but centuries. And so the devil comes along and he begins to move the pieces. He begins to move his pieces on the chessboard. And those pieces that are moved are not necessarily for things to happen in a few years, but they could be for things to happen in the next 50 years or in the next 100 years or hundreds of years from that point. Satan doesn't really care at all about humans. He influences humans, he possesses humans, but he doesn't give a damn about them. He uses humans to do his will, to do his work, his satanic work, but he doesn't care about the people who follow him. Even if you have someone who is dedicated to Satan, with the utmost amount of will and enthusiasm, Satan does not care about that person. Not only does he not care about that person, but he actually hates that person, because Satan hates humanity. He hates humans with the utmost amount of contempt and rage and disdain. And we see an example of this in the New Testament. Judas betrays Christ. Satan uses Judas's greed. The Bible tells us that Satan entered Judas, and really his greed is what controlled him. His greed is what helped lead him down this path of destruction. And the Bible says that Satan entered him, and he rose up and he went to the people who wanted to kill Christ. He went to who? The chief priests. He went to those people, and he got his money. And the devil used Judas as a tool, and Judas did the work of Satan. He betrayed Christ. He told the chief priest about Christ's whereabouts, where Christ was, how he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, which led to the arrest of Christ and ultimately to the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. And when Judas saw the end result of his work, that his actions led to the murder of an innocent man, he was guilt-ridden. And I think at that point, the devil just abandoned him. I think the devil gave him this feeling that he earned the money, that he was justified, that it was no big deal what he was doing, that he was doing nothing wrong. And then once it was all done, the devil abandoned him. And he lost that feeling. He felt empty and miserable and guilt-ridden. And then he began to have this suicidal ideation. And that's what Satan does to humans. He leads humanity to do evil, and then he will use your actions against you and say, oh, look at what you did. You're an evil sinner. It's like that movie, The Exorcist, which is a great movie, by the way, an excellent horror movie. I mean, some people have their criticism for The Exorcist, but it was a masterpiece of a film, very well done movie. Acting was great, and it's still a creepy movie. It came out in the 1970s, and I will watch that film at least once a year, and it still gives me the creeps. And in that movie, this demon is constantly reminding the young priest, Father Karras, of what he did to his mother. Father Karras put his mother into an old people's home, or really into a crazy house, or it was some kind of an insane asylum for the elderly. And his mother dies in this place, and she's miserable. And he visits his mother before she passes away, and she's like, Dimmy, why you do this to me? Dimmy, lie, Dimmy. And he's guilt-ridden. He's so guilt-ridden because he can't, it's difficult to take care of her, and he feels like he can't take care of her by himself, so he believes that his only option is to put his mom in this institution, and she dies in this horrendously miserable state. And so during the exorcism, you have this girl who's possessed, and she's on this bed, and this, very sinister, diabolical voice is coming out of her mouth. It's really, really disturbing. And this demon is constantly reminding Father Karras of what he did to his mother. And why was that? Why was the demon doing this to the priest? It was to push him into despair. And that's what Satan did to Judas, using his sins against him to try to push him into self-destruction. And Judas falls for this. And Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, I think did the best job in illustrating what Satan did to Judas. I don't think there was ever a film before The Passion of the Christ, at least not a seriously done movie, that really reenacted what Judas did, that really showed what Judas did. And the movie shows these children just ganging up on Judas, and they're surrounding him, and they're showing all their these are children, little Middle Eastern kids, but their faces are contorted and they're demonic, and it's really creepy. And in a way, The Passion of the Christ is a horror movie. I mean, in a way it is, right? But it's a horror movie that has an ending in which good triumphs over evil. And in this case, it's the ultimate good. And Judas kills himself. He wraps a noose around his neck, and he drops, and his guts break out of his body. And it's pretty brutal. But Satan wanted that. Why did Satan want this? Because he wants humanity to destroy itself. This is a part of the chess match between God and Satan. Satan wants to lead humanity into destruction, and God wants to lead humanity into redemption and salvation and eternal life. St. John, in one of his epistles, has a really profound verse. He says that, and for this reason Christ came to earth, to destroy the works of the devil. And St. John also writes, and I'm going to read you guys this verse, he also writes this in his first epistle, speaking of Cain, murdering his brother Abel. He says, "Be not as Cain, who was of that wicked one, Satan, and slew his brother. And why did he slay him? Because his works were evil, and his brothers were righteous." So it says that Cain was satanic, that he was possessed, that he was a slave of the devil. He was of the satanic and diabolical realm. And what did that lead Cain to do? It led him to commit murder. And this is what Satan wanted. He wants to see humanity killing itself. He gets a thrill out of it. He laughs at humanity as humanity glories in its own self-destruction. Humanity does glory in its own self-destruction, if you think about it. For example, I've been reading this book on the origins of Darwinism. It's called The Invention of Prehistory by Stefanos Gerolanos. So this is a Greek writer. And the book talks about how Darwinists began to glory in mankind's killing of itself, of human beings killing of one another. And it glorified this as natural. So the book talks about how Charles Darwin had an influence in all this. Darwin was the one who really codified evolutionism as a scientific belief, as a scientific theory. There were people before Darwin who came up with theories similar to his, but he was the one who really drove it into the mainstream. And Darwin taught that genocide is natural. And I talked about this in one of my last videos, but I want to drive this point forward, that Darwin had an influence in the destructive consequences of Darwinism. People will say, well, yes, the Nazis believed in eugenics and they believed in evolutionism, but what they did had nothing to do with Darwinism. And that's a bunch of garbage, because Charles Darwin taught that extermination, that genocide is natural. And that when two unequal races go head to head, the superior race will always exterminate the inferior race. And so when various European countries began to do their own genocides, they saw it as a demonstration of their superiority over the ones who they were exterminating. The Ottoman Empire believed in evolutionism during the Armenian genocide, and people don't talk about this, and I don't know why people don't talk about this. Maybe it's because they want to maintain this narrative that it's all just Islam and Muslims, but the worst genocide of Christians committed by the Ottoman Empire was not done by fanatical fundamentalist Muslim Turks. It was orchestrated by secular Europeanized Turks, who really are Europeans, but they're a southeastern European. They're more like Balkan people, Balkan Europeans, but Europeans nonetheless. And it was done. The Armenian genocide was orchestrated by westernized Turks who really admired the West for its technological innovation and who believed in evolutionism. And as I've said before, they were hardcore believers in the philosophy of Herbert Spencer, who was the one who coined the term survival of the fittest. And so when they were butchering the Armenians, they saw that as a demonstration of their racial superiority over an inferior race. So the race that is committing genocide is demonstrating its superiority simply by the fact that they are the ones doing the extermination. And the race that is being exterminated, in this case the Armenians, demonstrates its inferiority by the fact that it's the one being genocided. And so this is the evil of Darwinism. Charles Darwin didn't say, go out and exterminate the Jews. He didn't say, go out and kill this people or that people. He simply laid a scientific argument. He simply laid the foundation for a scientific justification for genocide. One of the main influences of Charles Darwin was Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was a British Anglican clergyman. He was a bishop, I believe, for the Church of England. Yeah, so much for following the Prince of Peace. And Thomas Malthus taught that if you have too many people in the world, you're going to have food shortages. So in order to have just enough food for enough people, allow certain people to be killed by natural disasters, and even facilitate those natural disasters if you can, in order to get rid of the undesirables so that there will be enough food for the rest of the world. And he said that if we're going to kill off some people or allow some people to be killed off and preserve the rest, let's at least promote the preservation of those who have the best genes. And if there's a natural disaster, or if we can summon, or if we can orchestrate a natural disaster, let's do it to kill off the undesirables so that we can kill off enough people so that there will be a good balance between population and the amount of food that we have on Earth. And Thomas Malthus influenced Darwin. This is what influenced Darwin. Because Darwin said, okay, well, if the unfit are the ones being killed because of natural disasters, then that means that the inferior genes got naturally selected, purged by natural selection, and the best genes, the fit genes, were the ones allowed by nature to pass on, thus continuing this process of lower primates evolving eventually into Homo sapiens, because the best genes would continue on, the unfit genes would be purged away by natural selection through war, famine, natural disasters, and the best fit people, the best fit creatures would be allowed to continue on in life, pass down their genes, and thus evolve. So Malthusianism was one of the main influences for Charles Darwin. And Malthusianism had an influence in a genocide that is not really talked about all that much. And you may be thinking, Ted, which genocide are you talking about? Are you talking about the genocide of the Aboriginals, the genocide of the Namibians by the Germans? Which genocide are you talking about? I'm talking about the genocide of the Irish people. And they don't talk about this, but the English, they pushed the Irish into having a famine, into suffering through a famine. They took all of Ireland's food. They plundered it, like the Anglo-Saxons did to the Celts back in the early Middle Ages. They took the food from the Irish. They took the meat from the Irish. And when all the Irish had was just mere potatoes, they took the potatoes from the Irish. And there was a blight that struck the Irish people's potato crops, and the Irish didn't have enough potatoes to sustain themselves. And the English came and said, well, we don't give a damn if you're going through a famine. Give us that bloody potatoes. And how many Irish people died because of that? 1 million Irish people, I believe. And that's the reason why all these Irish people came to the U.S. You think the Irish came to the U.S. because America's a beautiful country? They came to the U.S. because they were being genocided by the English. And what was the scientific ideology that the English utilized to justify their genocide of the Irish? They said, well, Malthus taught that because of overpopulation, there's not going to be enough food. So here we see the Irish going through a famine, and we're the superior people, so we're just going to take whatever food they have left so that we can allow an inferior people to die and starve to death. Malthus came before Darwin. And you could say, well, Malthus was a Christian. He was a bishop. But what does St. John tell us in his first epistle? Be not as Cain, who was of that wicked one and slew his brother. And why did he slay him? Because his own works were evil. So even though Malthus was a supposed Christian, his works were evil and his ideology led to mass murder. And this goes back to what I was saying, that the devil wants to see humanity's destruction. But it also goes back to what I was saying in regards to us, humanity, being in this cosmic chess match between God and Satan, and how Satan works for the long term. Because you could say, well, it goes back to Darwin, right? Evolutionism, Darwinism, eugenics. It goes back to Charles Darwin. But Darwin was influenced by Malthus, who was before Darwin. So you can see the devil moving his chess pieces. I'll influence Malthus, and through Malthus I'll influence Darwin, and through Darwin I will influence these various European countries to do genocides, and I will eventually influence Germany to do genocide. You see the pieces being moved, but the pieces are not being moved in terms of wanting to do an action in a decade or so, but wanting to do an action decades from that point, or even a century or centuries from that point. And so you can see the cosmic battle in the sense that you can see certain ideologies being pushed, and all these ideologies lead to destruction, to the slaughter of mankind. And just as Judas hung himself, Satan wants humanity to destroy itself. And he wants us to, as I said, glory in our self-destruction. So I want to give you guys an example as to what I mean by mankind glorying in self-destruction. So World War I, this is one of the greatest examples of mankind destroying itself. This is a very clear-cut demonstration of this, because so many countless lives were lost, entire generations were wiped out in World War I. And there was a guy by the name of Ernst Junger. Ernst Junger was a German man who fought in World War I. And after World War I, he wrote a book about his experiences in that war. Ernst Junger, being under the influence of Charles Darwin, glorified violence. And he glorified this idea of man as savage. He basically addresses this issue of why was mankind so savage? In particular, why was European man so savage? And what happened to civility? And Ernst Junger essentially said, all that civility stuff is a load of garbage. It's imposed on us. And through war, mankind can go through this experience of self-realization, this experience of enlightenment, by overthrowing this veneer of civility and showing his true self. And Ernst Junger uses this German term, the Urmensch, primitive man, so that man can become his true primitive self, the cave dweller, as he said. And he believed that through World War I, the German man came to a sense of enlightenment in the sense that he overthrew this mask of civility that was imposed on the Europeans and unleashed the primitive man within. And Ernst Junger was 100% being influenced by Darwinism here. Because what did Darwin teach? That genocide is natural, that killing and war is natural, that it's a natural condition of mankind, that mankind is naturally a savage, that within him is a primitive cave dweller, an Urmensch, to use the term of Ernst Junger. And so civility, which is something that came through Christian influence, civility was something that was imposed on man, and it's a fake mask. And so to find enlightenment, the German man took off this mask and became a savage. And it wasn't just the Germans who acted like savages in World War I. You could read about what the Austro-Hungarian army did in Serbia, how with their Croatian auxiliaries they butchered hundreds of thousands of Serbs. Somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 Serbs were butchered because of the Austro-Hungarian invasion of Serbia. And Ernst Junger gloried in this. He gloried in mankind's destruction, and Hitler also gloried in mankind's destruction in World War I. And I want to read to you guys this excerpt from this book, The Invention of Prehistory by Stefanos Geroulanos. And he talks about Ernst Junger and how Ernst Junger gloried in this self-destruction of mankind. Ernst Junger, the decorated and widely read German war veteran, celebrated the war's capacity to arouse the beast that had slept on the refined carpets of civilization. The Urmensch, or primal man, the cave dweller, in the, quote, these are his words, unbounded savagery of his unfettered instincts, unquote, had arisen from the depths of history to do battle to build a new world free from bourgeoisie constraints. For Junger and many others, fascists and even some on the left, the trenches had inaugurated a new age, even a new man. And so through World War I, mankind, in this case, the European man or the German man, finds enlightenment through war, death, destruction, and killing. And this really gives you an idea of what sort of ideas were being percolated before the Nazi takeover of Germany and before the rise of the Third Reich. And it really shows you that Europe was being influenced by these self-destructive ideas, these anti-human, anti-life, pro-death ideologies like Darwinism and fascism and really this glorification of violence, futurism. It really shows you the cosmic chess piece, right? Or chess pieces, I should say, being moved. The devil comes along, he goes to Malthus. Oh, well, he whispers into Malthus's ears, just like he entered Judas, just like he entered Cain before Cain murdered his brother Abel. He whispers into the ears of humanity, and he says, well, there's not enough food for all of humans. We should kill off some of the human population. And this is what he whispered into the ear of Thomas Malthus. And through Thomas Malthus, the devil influences Charles Darwin, and he says, mankind evolved from a lesser form of human, from some sort of lesser primate, and certain humans are more evolved than others. Therefore, when one nation genocides another, it is simply a demonstration of the genociding nation's superiority over the nation that is being genocided. And it demonstrates the inferiority of the nation that is being genocided. Therefore, you can simply say, I am merely following the laws of nature. And so the devil, through Darwin and through Malthus, makes mass murder natural. You're going to say, well, Ted, Darwin wasn't influenced by Satan. He was simply an observer. He went to this island, Galapagos Island, and he saw some birds. They were eating worms, and he's just a scientist. Look at who influenced Darwin. I know I brought up Thomas Malthus, but there was another influence on Darwin that not a lot of people talk about. But one of the main influences on Charles Darwin was a guy by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. And Alfred Russel Wallace was an occultist. And he actually came up with this ideology of natural selection before Darwin did. So Wallace was in the Malay archipelago. And while he was there, he would say in his delusional state, all species have evolved. With his shaking voice, he stated, while his face was covered with sweat, that all species have adapted and mutated. All living organisms have descended from earlier forms. And he was influenced by diabolical entities. And so while he was in his hut in the Malay archipelago, Wallace recounted, quote, somehow my thoughts turned. Turned to what? Turned to Thomas Malthus's book on population, which he had read 14 years earlier in Leicester. He continued to write in his recounting of his contemplation on Malthus and how Malthus inspired him in his acceptance of social Darwinism. And it says here, it occurred to ask the question, why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly that on the whole, the best fitted survive. From the effects of disease, the most healthy escape. From enemies, the strongest, the swiftest, or the most cunning. From famine, the best hunters, or those with the best digestion, and so on. Then it suddenly flashed upon me that this self-acting process would necessarily improve the race, because in every generation, the inferior would inevitably be killed off and the superior would remain. That is, the fittest would survive. And this is why I say Darwinism and those who were like Darwin really taught that genocide was natural, that genociding another race was simply the demonstration of the genocider's superiority and the inferiority of the nation of the race being exterminated. Satan wants to see mankind destroy itself. He goes to humanity and he says, no, you are superior to this other group, and this other group, well, they're a bunch of barbarians and they are inferior, so why don't you just exterminate them? Because in the process of nature, it is expected and natural for the superior to annihilate the inferior. And you fast forward to World War I, mankind destroyed itself immensely in Europe. And you had ideologies coming out. You had ideas coming out teaching what? That mankind, that European man, found enlightenment in World War I. And so people like Hitler, people like Ernest Junger, they gloried in mankind's destruction. All those who hate God love death. And it's interesting, when you read that verse in Proverbs, that verse says that this is wisdom speaking, that wisdom is the one declaring all those who hate me love death. So wisdom is saying, all those who hate me, wisdom, love death. And what does St. Paul say about Christ? That Christ is the wisdom of God, the wisdom of the Father. And so wisdom is speaking in the Old Testament saying, all those who hate me, Christ, God the Son, love death. All those who hate the Logos, because Christ is the Logos that became flesh. He is the Logos reincarnated as human, as humanity. All those who hate the Logos love death. All those who hate Christ love death. And you see how Satan influences humanity to glory in its own destruction, just as it convinced Judas to kill himself. And you fast forward to our own times, and what do you see? Palestinians still praising Hamas. You would think that after all of the destruction that the Palestinians have gone through in this war, they would say, no more Hamas. We don't want to be under Hamas ever again. But you see a huge chunk of the Gazan population saying that they still want to be governed by Hamas, even though it was Hamas that led to their destruction, that caused this destruction, because everyone knows how the Israelis react. Everyone knows that when you go into another country, you invade a country, and you butcher a bunch of people, that country is going to react violently, and even at times genocidally. Hamas didn't give a damn. Hamas did not give a damn. They went into Israel. They did an invasion of Israel. They butchered over 1,000 people. They did atrocities. That's not sit here and pretend that this didn't happen. Let's not pretend that Hamas is just some innocent group. And they committed atrocities. And what happened? Israel began to bombard Gaza and slaughter Gazans by the thousands, and did war crimes. And let's be real. Let's not sit here and pretend that Israel did not do war crimes. Israel did war crimes. And what do the Palestinians say? Not all Palestinians, but what have a lot of Palestinians said? We want Hamas to rule over us. Even though it was Hamas's attack that led the Israelis to do the butchering of your people, you still want to be... Look at Gaza. 60% of all the infrastructure destroyed. And you still want to be under the very organization that provoked the Israelis to do the destruction of your region. Yes. And what's their justification? Islam. Allahu Akbar. And they think that they're following God, but they're really just being influenced by jinn. Jinn is the Arabic word for demon. Jinn, like genie in Aladdin. They're really influenced by al-jinn, the demons. And Hamas thought that it was a great idea to enter Israel and kill a bunch of people, and they thought that they were following God. They thought they were doing God a service, but they were really just following the jinn. And so Satan goes to the Muslims, and he whispers into the ears of the Muslims, and he says, go out and kill the Yahud. This is what Islam demands. Kill the Yahud, the Jew. And the Muslim goes into Israel and kills the Yahud, and the Yahud does what? The Yahud begins to commit crimes, war crimes. And you hear stories about Israeli snipers killing Gazan civilians. You hear stories about Israelis having competitions amongst themselves over who can kill the most civilians in Gaza. You hear all sorts of horrific stories. A grandmother being shot in the head in front of her grandson. You hear a story about an Israeli soldier in Israel, or it was either in Israel or in a settlement, which is just a continuation of Israel. But you hear a story about an Israeli soldier shooting a man because he was an Arab, even though the man was a convert to Judaism. And he tells the man, are you an Arab or are you a Jew? He says, I'm a Jew. And this was a Palestinian man.
אתה יהודי? איך קוראים לך יהודי? איך קוראים לך? דוד? בן אברהם מטומטם. בן אברהם, יופי. בבקשה. תיגע בזה, אני ארוג אותך, אתה מבין אותי? ארוג אותי. ידיים למעלה עכשיו. הנה, ידיים למעלה. בדיוק. מה אתה רוצה? אני רוצה שאתה תסתום את הפה ולא לזוז. סתמתי פה, בסדר. הנה, בבקשה, וחזרתי אחורה. יהודי.
And he converted to Judaism because he loved the state of Israel. And he was arrested by the Palestinian Authority. He was taken to prison. He was tortured in prison by the Palestinians who were trying to force him to convert back to Islam. And he refused. He stayed loyal to Israel and his conviction in Judaism. And what happened? He wasn't even murdered by a Palestinian. He was murdered by a racist Jewish Israeli. And you could say, well, maybe the Israeli soldier thought that this guy was a terrorist. Doesn't matter. You can see the security footage of the guy before he gets shot. And this Palestinian man has his hands up in the air. He's not doing anything. And the Israeli soldier executes him right there at a bus stop. That's murder. And you know what happened to that soldier? Nothing. Nothing. You can also read about the execution of Ayed al-Halak, who was a mentally handicapped Palestinian man who was very, very autistic, and he had no weapons on him. And he was murdered by Israeli soldiers. Murdered. Straight up. Murder. No weapons. Was not posing a threat. Was clearly mentally handicapped. And he was murdered. And do you know what happened to the two soldiers who were involved in his killing? Nothing. Nothing. Nothing happened to them. And so what happens? The devil comes in and says to the Muslims, kill the Yahud, kill the Yahud, and the Muslim kills the Yahud, and then the devil goes to the Jews and he says, kill the Arab. The Talmud teaches that they're inferior, that they're animals, you're justified to do this, and he gets the Israelis to feel justified because of the crimes that certain Palestinians have done. And the devil loves this because he knows it's just a never-ending cycle of death, mayhem, and destruction. It's never ending. And anytime you see murder, anytime you see just cruelty, indifference to human suffering, you know that the devil is there. Because what does St. John tell us in his first epistle? That Cain was of Satan, and that's why he murdered his brother. All those who hate Christ love death. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.